Book 2, Chapter 27 of Resurrection. The last thing that kept Nekhludoff in Petersburg was the case of the sectarians, whose petition he intended to get his former fellow officer, aide-de-camp Bogotyrev, to hand to the Tsar. He came to Bogotyrev in the morning and found him about to go out, though still at breakfast. Bogotyrev was not tall, but firmly built and wonderfully strong. He could bend a horseshoe. A kind, honest, straight, and even liberal man. In spite of these qualities, he was intimate at court and very fond of the Tsar and his family, and by some strange method he managed, while living in that highest circle, to see nothing but the good in it and to take no part in the evil and the corruption. He never condemned anybody nor any measure, and either kept silent or spoke in a bold, loud voice, almost shouting what he had to say, and often laughing in the same boisterous manner. And he did not do it for diplomatic reasons, but because such was his character. "Ah, that's right that you have come. Would you like some breakfast? Sit down, the beefsteaks are fine. I always begin with something substantial. Begin and finish too. Ha ha ha! Well then, have a glass of wine," he shouted, pointing to a decanter of claret. "I have been thinking of you. I will hand on the petition. I shall put it into his own hands. You may count on that. Only it occurred to me that it would be best for you to call on Toporoff." Nekhludoff made a wry face at the mention of Toporoff. "It all depends on him. He will be consulted anyhow, and perhaps he may himself meet your wishes." "If you advise it, I shall go." "That's right. Well, and how does Petersburg agree with you?" shouted Bogotyrev. "Tell me, eh?" "I feel myself getting hypnotized," replied Nekhludoff. "Hypnotized," Bogotyrev repeated, and burst out laughing. "You won't have anything? Well, just as you please," and he wiped his moustaches with his napkin. "Then you'll go, eh? If he does not do it, give the petition to me, and I shall hand it on tomorrow." Shouting these words, he rose, crossed himself just as naturally as he had wiped his mouth, and began buckling on his sword. "And now, good-bye. I must go. We are both going out," said Nekhludoff, and shaking Bogotyryev's strong, broad hand, and with the sense of pleasure which the impression of something healthy and unconsciously fresh always gave him, Nekhludoff parted from Bogotyrev on the doorsteps. Though he expected no good result from his visit, still Nekhludoff, following Bogotyryev's advice, went to see Toporoff, on whom the sectarian's fate depended. The position occupied by Toporoff, involving as it did an incongruity of purpose, could only be held by a dull man devoid of moral sensibility. Toporoff possessed both these negative qualities. The incongruity of the position he occupied was this: it was his duty to keep up and to defend by external measures, not excluding violence, that church which, by its own declaration, was established by God himself, and could not be shaken by the gates of hell, nor by anything human. This divine and immutable God-established institution had to be sustained and defended by a human institution, the Holy Synod, managed by Toporoff and his officials. Toporoff did not see this contradiction, nor did he wish to see it, and he was, therefore, much concerned lest some Romish priest, some pastor, or some sectarian should destroy that church which the gates of hell could not conquer. Toporoff, like all those who are quite destitute of the fundamental religious feeling that recognizes the equality and brotherhood of men, was fully convinced that the common people were creatures entirely different from himself, and that the people needed what he could very well do without, for at the bottom of his heart he believed in nothing, and found such a state very convenient and pleasant. Yet he feared lest the people might also come to such a state, and looked upon it as his sacred duty, as he called it, to save the people therefrom. A certain cookery book declares that some crabs like to be boiled alive. In the same way he thought and spoke as if the people liked being kept in superstition, only he meant this in a literal sense, whereas the cookery book did not mean its words literally. His feelings towards the religion he was keeping up were the same as those of the poultry keeper towards the carrion he fed his fowls on. Carrion was very disgusting, but the fowls liked it. Therefore it was right to feed the fowls on carrion. Of course, all this worship of the images of the Iberian, Kasan and Smolensk Mothers of God was a gross superstition, but the people liked it and believed in it, and therefore the superstition must be kept up. Thus thought Toporov, not considering that the people only liked superstition because there always have been, and still are, men like himself who, being enlightened, instead of using their light to help others to struggle out of their dark ignorance, use it to plunge them still deeper into it. When Nekhludoff entered the reception room, Toporov was in his study, talking with an abbess, a lively and aristocratic lady, who was spreading the Greek Orthodox faith in Western Russia among the Uniates, who acknowledge the Pope of Rome, and who have the Greek religion enforced on them. An official who was in the reception room inquired what Nekhludoff wanted, and when he heard that Nekhludoff meant to hand in a petition to the Emperor, he asked him if he would allow the petition to be read first. Nekhludoff gave it to him, and the official took it into the study. The abbess, with her hood and flowing veil and her long train trailing behind, left the study and went out, her white hands, with their well-tended nails, holding a topaz rosary. Nekhludoff was not immediately asked to come in. Toporov was reading the petition and shaking his head. He was unpleasantly surprised by the clear and emphatic wording of it. If it gets into the hands of the Emperor, it may cause misunderstandings, and unpleasant questions may be asked, he thought as he read. Then he put the petition on the table, rang, and ordered Nekhludoff to be asked in. He remembered the case of the sectarians. He had had a petition from them before. The case was this. These Christians, fallen away from the Greek Orthodox Church, were first exhorted and then tried by law, but were acquitted. Then the archdeacon and the governor arranged, on the plea that their marriages were illegal, to exile these sectarians, separating the husbands, wives, and children. These fathers and wives were now petitioning that they should not be parted. Toporov recollected the first time the case came to his notice. He had at that time hesitated whether he had not better put a stop to it. But then he thought no harm could result from his confirming the decision to separate and exile the different members of the sectarian families, whereas allowing the peasant sect to remain where it was might have a bad effect on the rest of the inhabitants of the place and cause them to fall away from orthodoxy. And then the affair also proved the zeal of the archdeacon, and so he let the case proceed along the lines it had taken. But now that they had a defender such as Nekhludoff, who had some influence in Petersburg, the case might be specially pointed out to the Emperor as something cruel, or it might get into the foreign papers. Therefore, he at once took an unexpected decision. "How do you do?" he said, with the air of a very busy man, receiving Nekhludoff standing, and at once starting on the business. "I know this case. As soon as I saw the names, I recollected this unfortunate business," he said, taking up the petition and showing it to Nekhludoff, "and I am much indebted to you for reminding me of it. It is the overzealousness of the provincial authorities." Nekhludoff stood silent, looking with no kindly feelings at the immovable, pale mask of a face before him. "And I shall give orders that these measures should be revoked and the people reinstated in their homes." "So that I need not make use of this petition?" "I promise you most assuredly," answered Toporov, laying a stress on the word "I," as if quite convinced that his honesty, his word, was the best guarantee. "It will be best if I write at once. Take a seat, please." He went up to the table and began to write. As Nekhludoff sat down, He looked at the narrow, bald skull, at the fat, blue-veined hand that was swiftly guiding the pen, and wondered why this evidently indifferent man was doing what he did, and why he was doing it with such care. "Well, here you are," said Toporov, sealing the envelope. "You may let your clients know," and he stretched his lips to imitate a smile. "Then what did these people suffer for?" Nekhludoff asked, as he took the envelope. Toporov raised his head and smiled, as if Nekhludoff's question gave him pleasure. "That I cannot tell. All I can say is that the interests of the people guarded by us are so important that too great a zeal in matters of religion is not so dangerous or so harmful as the indifference which is now spreading." "But how is it that in the name of religion the very first demands of righteousness are violated? Families are separated." Toporov continued to smile patronizingly, evidently thinking what Nekhludoff said very pretty. Anything that Nekhludoff could say he would have considered very pretty and very one-sided from the height of what he considered his far-reaching office in the state. "It may seem so from the point of view of a private individual," he said, "but from an administrative point of view it appears in a rather different light. However, I must bid you good-bye now," said Toporov, bowing his head and holding out his hand, which Nekhludoff pressed. "The interests of the people? Your interest is what you mean," thought Nekhludoff as he went out, and he ran over in his mind the people in whom is manifested the activity of the institutions that uphold religion and educate the people. He began with the woman punished for the illicit sale of spirits, the boy for theft, the tramp for tramping, the incendiary for setting a house on fire, the banker for fraud, and that unfortunate Lydia Shostova, imprisoned only because they hoped to get such information as they required from her. Then he thought of the sectarians punished for violating orthodoxy, and Gorkovitch for wanting constitutional government, and Nekhludoff clearly saw that all these people were arrested, locked up, exiled, not really because they transgressed against justice or behaved unlawfully, but only because they were an obstacle hindering the officials and the rich from enjoying the property they had taken away from the people. And the woman who sold wine without having a license, and the thief knocking about the town, and Lydia Shostova hiding proclamations, and the sectarians upsetting superstitions, and Gorkovitch desiring a constitution, were a real hindrance. It seemed perfectly clear to Nekhludoff that all these officials, beginning with his aunt's husband, the senators and Toporov, down to those clean and correct gentlemen who sat at the tables in the ministry office, were not at all troubled by the fact that in such a state of things the innocent had to suffer, but were only concerned how to get rid of the really dangerous, so that the rule that 10 guilty should escape rather than that 1 innocent should be condemned was not observed, but on the contrary, for the sake of getting rid of 1 really dangerous person, 10 who seemed dangerous were punished, as when cutting a rotten piece out of anything, one has to cut away some that is good. This explanation seemed very simple and clear to Nekhludoff, but its very simplicity and clearness made him hesitate to accept it. Was it possible that so complicated a phenomenon could have so simple and terrible an explanation? Was it possible that all these words about justice, law, religion, God, and so on, were mere words, hiding the coarsest cupidity and cruelty? End of Book 2, Chapter 27. Book 2, Chapter 28 of Resurrection. Nekhludoff would have left Petersburg on the evening of the same day, but he had promised Mariette to meet her at the theatre, and though he knew that he ought not to keep that promise, he deceived himself into the belief that it would not be right to break his word. "Am I capable of withstanding these temptations?" he asked himself, not quite honestly. "I shall try for the last time." He dressed in his evening clothes and arrived at the theatre during the second act of the eternal Dame aux Camélias, in which a foreign actress once again, and in a novel manner, showed how women die of consumption. The theatre was quite full. Mariette's box was at once, and with great deference, shown to Nekhludoff at his request. A liveried servant stood in the corridor outside. He bowed to Nekhludoff as to one whom he knew, and opened the door of the box. All the people who sat and stood in the boxes on the opposite side, those who sat near and those who were in the parterre, with their grey, grizzly, bald, or curly heads, all were absorbed in watching the thin, bony actress who, dressed in silks and laces, was wriggling before them and speaking in an unnatural voice. Someone called "Hush!" when the door opened, and two streams, one of cool, the other of hot, air touched Nekhludoff's face. Mariette and a lady whom he did not know, with a red cape and a big, heavy head-dress, were in the box, and two men also. Mariette's husband, the General, a tall, handsome man with a severe, inscrutable countenance, a Roman nose, and a uniform padded round the chest, and a fair man with a bit of shaved chin between pompous whiskers. Mariette, graceful, slight, elegant, her low neck dress showing her firm, shapely, slanting shoulders, with a little black mole where they joined her neck, immediately turned and pointed with her face to a chair behind her in an engaging manner, and smiled a smile that seemed full of meaning to Nekhludoff. The husband looked at him in the quiet way in which he did everything, and bowed. In the look he exchanged with his wife, the master, the owner of a beautiful woman, was to be seen at once. When the monologue was over, the theatre resounded with the clapping of hands. Mariette rose, and holding up her rustling silk skirt, went into the back of the box and introduced Nekhludoff to her husband. The General, without ceasing to smile with his eyes, said he was very pleased, and then sat inscrutably silent. "I ought to have left to-day, had I not promised," said Nekhludoff to Mariette. "If you do not care to see me," said Mariette, in answer to what his words implied, "you will see a wonderful actress. Was she not splendid in the last scene?" she asked, turning to her husband. The husband bowed his head. "This sort of thing does not touch me," said Nekhludoff. "I have seen so much real suffering lately that—" "Yes, sit down and tell me." The husband listened, his eyes smiling more and more ironically. "I have been to see that woman whom they have set free, and who has been kept in prison for so long. She is quite broken down." "That is the woman I spoke to you about," Mariette said to her husband. "Oh, yes, I was very pleased that she could be set free," said the husband quietly, nodding and smiling under his moustache with evident irony, so it seemed to Nekhludoff. "I shall go and have a smoke." Nekhludoff sat waiting to hear what the something was that Mariette had to tell him. She said nothing, and did not even try to say anything, but joked and spoke about the performance, which she thought ought to touch Nekhludoff. Nekhludoff saw that she had nothing to tell, but only wished to show herself to him in all the splendour of her evening toilet, with her shoulders and little mole, and this was pleasant and yet repulsive to him. The charm that had veiled all this sort of thing from Nekhludoff was not removed, but it was as if he could see what lay beneath. Looking at Mariette, he admired her, and yet he knew that she was a liar, living with a husband who was making his career by means of the tears and lives of hundreds and hundreds of people, and that she was quite indifferent about it, and that all she had said the day before was untrue. What she wanted, neither he nor she knew why, was to make him fall in love with her. This both attracted and disgusted him. Several times, on the point of going away, he took up his hat and then stayed on. But at last, when the husband returned with a strong smell of tobacco in his thick moustache, and looked at Nekhludoff with a patronizing, contemptuous air as if not recognizing him, Nekhludoff left the box before the door was closed again, found his overcoat, and went out of the theatre. As he was walking home along the Nevsky, he could not help noticing a well-shaped and aggressively finely dressed woman who was quietly walking in front of him along the broad asphalt pavement. The consciousness of her detestable power was noticeable in her face and the whole of her figure. All who met or passed that woman looked at her. Nekhludoff walked faster than she did, and involuntarily also looked her in the face. The face, which was probably painted, was handsome, and the woman looked at him with a smile, and her eyes sparkled. And curiously enough, Nekhludoff was suddenly reminded of Mariette, because he again felt both attracted and disgusted, just as when in the theatre. Having hurriedly passed her, Nekhludoff turned off onto the Morskaya and passed on to the embankment, where, to the surprise of a policeman, he began pacing up and down the pavement. "The other one gave me just such a smile when I entered the theatre," he thought, "and the meaning of the smile was the same. The only difference is that this one said plainly, 'If you want me, take me. If not, go your way.' And the other one pretended that she was not thinking of this, but living in some high and refined state, while this was really at the root. Besides, this one was driven to it by necessity, while the other amused herself by playing with that enchanting, disgusting, frightful passion. This woman of the street was like stagnant, smelling water offered to those whose thirst was greater than their disgust. That other one in the theatre was like the poison which, unnoticed, poisons everything it gets into." Nekhludoff recalled his liaison with the Marechal's wife, and shameful memories rose before him. "The animalism of the brute nature in man is disgusting," thought he, "but as long as it remains in its naked form, we observe it from the height of our spiritual life and despise it, and, whether one has fallen or resisted, one remains what one was before. But when that same animalism hides under a cloak of poetry and aesthetic feeling and demands our worship, then we are swallowed up by it completely and worship animalism, no longer distinguishing good from evil. Then it is awful." Nekhludoff perceived all this now as clearly as he saw the palace, the sentinels, the fortress, the river, the boats, and the stock exchange. And just as on this northern summer night there was no restful darkness on the earth, but only a dismal, dull light coming from an invisible source, so in Nekhludoff's soul there was no longer the restful darkness, ignorance. Everything seemed clear. It was clear that everything considered important and good was insignificant and repulsive, and that all the glamour and luxury hid the old, well-known crimes, which not only remained unpunished, but were adorned with all the splendour which men were capable of inventing. Nekhludoff wished to forget all this, not to see it, but he could no longer help seeing it, though he could not see the source of the light which revealed it to him any more than he could see the source of the light which lay over Petersburg. And though the light appeared to him dull, dismal, and unnatural, yet he could not help seeing what it revealed, and he felt both joyful and anxious. End of Book 2, Chapter 28.